happy to be here and excited to see so many young people and their teachers who are interested in government and politics and trying to make our election system better. What I want to do is give a little bit of an overview of the evolution of the political campaign system and particularly the media environment. What I study is new media in politics primarily, which is the way that our media system has transitioned from focusing primarily on newspapers and radio and traditional type of television news to the type of thing that you've all grown up with, which is all sorts of internet sources and Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and all sorts of social media that have entered into the picture. This has completely changed the way that candidates have to conduct their campaigns, and I just want to talk about it in terms of the complications that this new media environment has introduced into the political campaigning process. It's much more challenging now for candidates to run a campaign than it was in the era of newspapers or the era of television when those were the main sources where people got their information. And you saw from the slides in the previous session how the audience has kind of become more divided and is moving more towards new sources of political media. Over the past 2 decades, I think the 2 major trends that we've seen that influence the campaign media system are the introduction of these new media that I just mentioned, and also the evolution of the 24-hour news cycle, where news just happens very, very quickly, rapidly, fast-paced. It's now, used to have a very set time frame. There were very established norms that journalists followed, and candidates could tailor their campaign strategies to meet the norms and the time frame that were used by journalists and mainstream news organizations. But now, news can break at any time, and it can come from any place. It's not just journalists going out and getting information and putting it into a more formalized format and getting it out on television or newspaper or radio or news magazines. It's now journalists, bloggers, people like yourselves who are out there generating information. I'm not saying that all of it is news. Information, some of it's news, some of it is are facts, some of it's personal observations, a lot of it's commentary, and a lot of it is also rumor. So there's a lot of things for candidates to negotiate in an environment where you have so much information getting out from so many different platforms in so many different ways, all throughout the day in a cycle that never stops. At the same time, we can't forget the statistic that we saw there earlier about television. Most people still, a majority of people are still saying that television is their main source of campaign news. Now, a lot of that television is the 24-hour news television, which has a different dynamic than when we would sit down and watch the nightly evening news during a fixed time. But still, it's important to take into account that television and the vestiges of a traditional media system are still in place, even as we've moved into this much more volatile, much more complex media system. Let me just talk quickly about how the election media environment has changed from that traditional media system, which I mentioned is kind of traditional print, where journalists would go out, get information, talk to candidates, follow them on the campaign trail, report on it in newspapers, report on it in the nightly news, report on it on radio or in news magazines, to what we call the new media. And the way that I see it, we first started to see a type of new media in around 1988. And the first election cycle that it probably affected was the 1992 campaign. And this is a kind of new media that I call old technology, new politics, because this is where we started to see candidates using what used to be entertainment programs and entertainment magazines and print sources to get their message out to the public, because they were really tired to conforming to what the mainstream media would require. They would set up all their events to, kind of conform to the practices of the mainstream journalists. They would time their campaign kind of in a sequence that would appeal to the mainstream journalist. And even then, they were feeling that they had less power over getting their message out. So in the 1992 campaign, we saw candidates like Bill Clinton go on to late-night talk shows like Arsenio Hall and get his message out in an informal format, playing the saxophone, donning shades, trying to be hip and relating to the public, and it went over really well. In that campaign, we also had a third-party candidate, Ross Perot, who used those same types of techniques, maybe a little bit less, more low-key, but he still used them and also was able to make a fairly decent run for a third-party candidate in that campaign. So candidates started to see that going the entertainment route as part of their strategy was a good thing to do, a good strategic move. But quickly, new technologies came on the scene, particularly the internet, and candidates started to use these new technologies to get involved in the campaign as well. But keep in mind that they were still keeping this kind of entertainment element, new media element, as part of their campaign. I marked the 2000 campaign as kind of a landmark for new media because we started to see candidates using more sophisticated websites, using the online sources as a way to raise funds, organize volunteers, get people to meet up offline. There was a lot of activities that went on through new media in 2000. And I think the third generation of new media politics we really saw in the 2008 campaign, where it was really, kind of a complete step up in terms of the introduction of the social media that all of you use every day, introducing Facebook in particular and YouTube in order to engage the campaign. What I think is important to keep in mind, even as all these new developments have been occurring, that if you look at the data about how many people actually use these new techniques during the 2008 and 2010 campaigns, the percentages are relatively small. But the fact that people are only a limited number of the population are using, for example, Twitter to follow the campaign, or following candidate websites, or using some of these specialized media platforms is small, underestimates their real importance, because information that's disseminated in those venues gets picked up by more prominent mainstream type media, and it gets disseminated more widely. So these media have major implications, even if the number of audience members that are using them may be at this point in time very small. What we have now is a multi-layered communications environment for election campaigns, and this makes it very tricky for candidates to wage their campaigns. What candidates need to do is keep in mind that we still have traditional media. They're not going away. People have been predicting that we were going to see the end of the nightly news for 2 or 3 decades now. It's still there, and people still tune into it. And television, again, is the main source of election information, particularly for people over the age of 35 or 40. At the same time, candidates have to pay attention to new media and develop a strategy for dealing with new media and using that effectively in the campaign. So campaigns have become much, much more complicated for candidates to run in this time period. This is a general shift away from what we used to call a broadcasting model, where you have general interest news about campaigns and candidates and issues that's transmitted to the general public through some sort of a mass medium like television or a wide circulation newspaper. What we're moving more towards, and what's existing simultaneously, is what we would call a narrowcasting model, which we have carefully crafted messages that are targeted towards specific, discrete audiences with very carefully crafted, specialized messages. So today's candidates have this challenge. They have to develop a core message that has broad appeal, broadcast message, and then they also have to have a messaging strategy that taps into targeted constituencies with specific appeals, which is the narrowcasting strategy. As I've mentioned, courting the mainstream press is still an important aspect of a candidate's campaign strategy, although that role is shifting a little bit. There still are journalists out there that are covering the campaign, and there's a small number of them that are still on the campaign trail with the candidates. And these journalists are the source of a lot of original campaign information that makes it out, now all in a wide range of channels. You get an article in the New York Times that's written by a journalist who happens to be on the campaign trail, that's gotten an interview with the candidate, that's been an eyewitness to the candidate's speeches on the campaign trail. Candidate can write an article, the journalist will write an article, and all sorts of news organizations, formal and informal, blogs, all sorts of micro targeting sites will all pick up bits and pieces of the article or forward the whole article. That article has a second life as it's repurposed, and the information is widely disseminated. So even though there's fewer journalists and perhaps fewer voices giving kind of original professional information about the campaign out there, their voices are still heard rather loudly, and they are disseminated through all these different sources. The traditional media also has a brand new role that we've seen as a result of the new media era, and that is that they become aggregators. They become a place where they grab news and information from all sorts of sites and places, including information that you guys could generate if you went to see a candidate and wrote up a little blog piece or took a video. They aggregate this information, and then because their platforms tend to have more people that come to them, a broader audience, they are able to get this information out to that audience as well. So traditional media have kind of their traditional role and then this kind of new media role. Let's see. The mainstream media are important because they actually validate information that gets out on new media and social media, such as blogs and Twitter feed. So even in the new media era, the traditional media and television especially remain very, very important. For candidates, they can ignore the mainstream media at their own peril. There are some candidates who have been sort of successful claiming that this is the strategy, and I would talk about the Tea Party here. There's some Tea Party candidates who have said, they've staked their reputation on the fact that they're rejecting the mainstream press. They don't want to be part of the lamestream press, to use Sarah Palin's term. Yet the way that they get validation and the way that they get publicity for their campaigns and the way that local and regional candidates become national candidates is through the traditional or mainstream media. So as much as candidates would like to, kind of run their campaign against the media, they end up benefiting from coverage from the mainstream media. Let me see. I think another challenge that candidates have is that they have their own organized campaign structure and their own organized campaign organization, and they have their own strategy. But the new media environment, with all the technological tools that are out there, allow people to freelance on their own, either on behalf of a candidate or against a candidate. And so candidates have a much more difficult time trying to control their message and also trying to deal with all these additional messages that are getting out there. Some people might be doing the best they can to promote a candidate and feel like they're on their side by doing their own, campaign efforts, but sometimes that might clash with what a candidate wants to do and just adds a layer of complication. The Obama campaign did a very good job of embracing that, kind of bringing them into the fold and, kind of seeing where that was happening, evaluating that, and then working with that to make it an advantage. But it can also be a disadvantage. I have a lot more to say, but maybe let me just sum up by talking about what does all of this mean for the do's and don'ts of campaigning. First of all, I think it's a real challenge for candidates in this environment because they now, in a way, have to be super candidates. You have to be very comfortable dealing with kind of more traditional types of media and journalists that are still out there, but you also have to be very effective in new media and social media and dealing in all types of different contexts. So the candidates in their campaign organizations must manage the campaigns on multiple fronts. Media strategies and campaign strategies are now much more complex, and they involve innovation. So candidates have to figure out when should they be innovative, when should they try something new, say with social media, and when should they rely more on traditional media. When do these dovetailing strategies, kind of work, and when don't they work? They also have to devise strategies now that make it easier to engage voters who have busy schedules and who also are really reluctant to spend a lot of time on politics. So people are thinking, well, I have these tools, I can go to the internet, I should have everything, at my fingertips. And that's why I think candidates who have websites that are basically one-stop shops for voters, that have everything from information, ads, videos, places where people can donate, ways of organizing volunteers, and ways of getting people involved in the campaign is an important aspect of success for candidates. Also, this campaign environment is much more negative, I've summed up, and much less civil. And so candidates really have to always be on their guard in a way that they've never been in the past, because someone with a video camera can find you in an awkward moment and create an embarrassing situation that candidates have to react to quickly. Thank you.
I want to talk briefly about the theme here, do's and don'ts of a campaign. I've been involved in campaigns for 25 plus years. I've seen a lot of changes over the years and how they've grown from a basic premise of the guy with the most money is going to probably win to nowadays where it is focused on all aspects of getting your message out, being consistent with your message, making sure you don't screw up here or there, and then also raising as much money as you can to be able to buy that media, which is much more complicated than it used to be. 25 years or so ago, it was very easy for a political consultant to come into a candidate and say, okay, here's what we're going to do to win the race, whether it's running for Congress, running for Senate, running for a county commission seat, or a big city mayor. We're going to go out and we're going to raise more money than the other guy. There's 3 or 4 television stations, broadcast media, that we're going to buy TV for. We've identified several radio stations that the constituents listen to that we're going to buy there, and we're also going to try to get some good stories in the newspaper on earned media. After that, it wasn't particularly difficult. In this new 24/7 media world that we live in, it is much more complicated now. I mean, one of our theories used to be was, if things aren't going real well, send the candidate on vacation for a few months, continue to raise money, and nobody's really focusing on the race, and bring them back and they'll be refreshed and ready to go. Well, nowadays with 24/7 media, candidates always have to be, once they've declared for running for office, or have to be on the ball. A couple years ago, we saw a great example. How many of you guys have ever heard of a former senator named George Allen? All right, George Allen was a senator from state of Virginia. 2006, he was running for re-election. A lot of folks inside the Beltway in D.C. thought this guy could have the timbers to be president one day. He was running against a gentleman who didn't have particularly great credentials in Virginia. And it was a former person that had worked in the Pentagon and had been a businessman and a writer, but it wasn't a top-tier candidate, so to speak, that year. Well, Mr. Allen on the campaign stump made some statements one day that were caught on film by somebody following him. They were fairly derogatory, and that was picked up by everybody and their brother in the broadcast media. And so for literally, if you lived in Washington, D.C. or in Virginia, for 3 weeks to a month, you saw this tape of Mr. Allen making a statement, and you would cringe. Long and short of it is George Allen lost his reelect that year for nothing more than basically one screw-up that he had while he was on the stump one day. So it goes to show you candidates nowadays have to always be on their guard. They cannot rely on what they've been doing in the past. You always have to be sharp. Another great example is what we saw a week or so ago in the presidential debate here in Orlando on the Republican side. Rick Perry, who's been the front runner for the past couple weeks, kind of thrust up above everybody else as the guy that could be the Republican nominee. He's had the momentum in recent polls and looked pretty good on paper. A lot of people are attracted to him on the Republican side. Well, he looked horrible the other night in the debate here in Orlando. A lot of people are scratching their heads now on the Republican side of the aisle, questioning where he is on some issues such as immigration and others. Now, he'll probably get over that in the next couple of weeks and try to focus his campaign back on issues and things he wants to talk about, but there's always going to be that lingering question amongst the constituents out there of where is he on issues. One of the biggest problems nowadays with candidates is consistency on issues. If you are a Democratic candidate for office, and a good example is Senator Casey from Pennsylvania. This is a guy who is a Democrat who's elected U.S. Senate from the state of Pennsylvania, but on social issues he is pro-life, which you don't find a whole lot on the Democratic side of the aisle. But the one thing he's survived on because of that, he's been consistent over the years in keeping his same message on that particular issue. And whether you agree or disagree with him, what we found out is voters will say, okay, well, we agree or we'll disagree, but we'll move on that particular issue because we know where he is, and he's not going to change his particular stance on that issue. And over the years that with this new invention of social media and 24/7 television and everything else we have, it has become much more important that candidates are consistent on their messages, whether it's social issues, the economy, foreign relations, you name it. Another example is recent we've seen President Obama taking a lot of heat from the Jewish organizations in this country on his stance and what we should do with Palestine. For better or for worse, he has taken a pounding in the past couple weeks. We had a recent election in New York for a congressional seat that, since 1922 has been held by Democrats, where a Republican won. It's one of those things that consistency on issues is important, and when you're moving around like that, you tend to upset your base and others, which at the end of the day does not help you in the election. Back when I started in this business, you would have consultants would come in and say, okay, we need to raise as much money as we can, get ready to buy media, whether it was television, the 3 broadcast stations, radio, or to try to get advertising in print somewhere. That was pretty much where you spent your money and your energy. Outside of that, you would work the candidate trying to get earned media stories in newspapers, as the folks have talked about earlier. Well, in the last 20 years, that's changed dramatically. And nowadays, it is much more difficult to, when you're a consultant, figure out how you're going to spend that money. I had one consultant years ago that used to tell us, the old adage of don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes. Campaigns would purchase media, television and radio, starting an election a couple days before Election Day, and then backfill it with as much money as they can. Nowadays, you have folks that are coming up early and often. An example is Ron Paul, who's running the Republican side for the presidential nomination, congressman from Texas. He, in recent weeks, has decided to make media buys in certain states that people are scratching their heads saying, well, why is he doing that? Well, he wants to try to get some momentum early and move up in the pack and distinguish himself from the others. We'll see if that helps or not. But that's just one example of the choices that you have to make nowadays. I ran a campaign back in 2004, a U.S. Senate campaign, and it was down here in Florida. We have 12 media markets. Previously to that race, when I would make media buys, I would look around the state, and the way you make media buys is buying points with television stations, and you would use anywhere from 1,200 gross ratings points to 1,400 gross ratings points in a particular market to get your message to click with that voter. Well, 2004 was the first year that I saw that when you made media buys, you would have to buy 1,800 gross ratings points, 2,000 gross ratings points, 2,200 gross ratings points to get that message to finally click. And the reason for that is with all the different cable channels you have out there today, the different social media, the internet, people are not focusing on 2 or 3 television stations anymore like they used to. It's a broad array. So, as somebody, you're working on a campaign and you have your team with you, you have to make those decisions on where you want to spend that money. And it's a much more difficult effort nowadays than it was 20, 30 years ago. Do you want to buy early? Do you want to buy later in the race? Do you want to attack your opponent? Do you want to, highlight particular issues? Some of the earlier panelists mentioned Citizens United, which is a court case that was in the Supreme Court a couple of years ago. That particular court case is dramatically going to change the way campaigns are run in this country. We saw in this last election, 2010, where you will now have a candidate running and he's using his money to help support himself. Well, you have also now the ability of independent folks to get involved, and it's issue advocacy, but in essence, they can spend millions of dollars backing a particular candidate on particular issues and helping bolster their efforts. So you have that to compute into. You cannot coordinate with those folks. That's against the law, but they're out there. When you're running a campaign, you'll hear through the grapevine that a group that's favorable on taxes to your candidate, so to speak, is particularly interested in helping, and you can always find out that they're doing a media buy here or there or the other place. And it's one of those things that you got to factor into the equation of when you're running a campaign. How is this going to help us? Can we use our resources in different ways in the future instead of directing them all towards media, which will be saturated by what they're doing? It is a new game. We talked earlier, and some of the panelists had some graphs about demographics and voter demographics. 30 years ago, it was pretty much a given thing that those between the ages of 18 and 26 did not get out and vote. That it was a very small group of folks out there that were active in that age group. Nowadays, it's grown dramatically. We have a good example of that is this last presidential campaign. A guy named David Axelrod, who you guys might have heard of, who was the campaign manager for President Obama. He was approached by some folks within the social media world that wanted to help him generate votes for his candidate. Him and the campaign manager, David Flam, and some others sat down and said, gee, how do we translate this social media effort into votes? Well, they thought it was a little difficult to do that. They thought, to get somebody to actually get off their duff, i.e. a college student, and actually go down and register, and then to show up at the polling station or mail in a campaign election ballot was probably too difficult. So what they decided to do was to start with raising money. And their view was it was a simple thing to do. Somebody would get an email encouraging their friends to join them in the Obama campaign. All they had to do, they're sitting at the computers, reach in their back pocket, pull out a credit card, enter in a credit card, $5 donation, and there you go. And what it did is it highlighted the fact that there are much more different ways to fundraise than in previous years. I mean, we used to rely on, as you've probably heard of wealthy individuals that are referred to as bundlers. Those are people that are in your neighborhood, friends of your parents that might have a cocktail party and invite the candidate into their home where they would raise some money for that candidate. Those were usually the big players in past campaigns. Nowadays, they are probably not as important as they used to be. And it'll be interesting to see as we move forward in this next campaign how much the percentage of money comes from smaller donors through that process. I mean, you have the Obama campaign that when they turn on the engine to raise money, they're going to be able to raise millions and millions and millions of dollars from all different arenas that traditional candidates haven't been able to do. So it'll be interesting to watch how that plays out. Have any more time? The other thing I want to mention is the way of getting your message across has changed dramatically. Before it was you have a simple message, 30-second ad, 67 words or less would be a television commercial. Nowadays we have the internet, where we have another example. Governor Perry's campaign about 2-3 weeks ago released an internet ad, which we sometimes refer to as teasers. These are ads that usually are 45 seconds to a minute. There's a chance that you could cut them up a little bit and put it on a TV ad, but it's unlikely. These type of ads, we haven't really studied enough to know what the effects are, but over the future, I think they're going to be much more effective as everybody in this country has computers now in the digital age. It's dramatically different than what happened years ago when the focus was in essence on those people between the ages of 40 and 60 and getting them out to vote. They watched television. They might have had an AOL account, and that was about it. Younger people and then also middle-aged folks are much more internet savvy these days, and that's going to be a huge message in the future. A huge way of getting your message out is the internet. Folks in my shoes that run campaigns in the future will not be able to rely on, okay, we raised more money than the other guy, we'll probably win. Those days are over. It takes much more creativity these days. Candidates have to be much more disciplined, and it's just a different world than it used to be 30, 25 years ago. Thank you.
Political campaign. Recently, the Florida straw poll came out with results that Herman Cain won by a large majority. Rick Perry came in second, and Romney came in a close third. Now, it's been speculated that Romney supporters had been organized to vote for Herman Cain so that Perry would not come in first. With the mass media being so important nowadays as it is, was this a wise strategy or one that was not so wise performed by Romney?
Scott, you?
Yeah, if that is the case, and it sounds plausible, I think it was a pretty wise choice by Romney because he was able to Rick Perry was gaining on him in other places and seemed to be his most formidable challenger. And the straw poll in and of itself, it's a small number of people. It's, it really means nothing. It's just in and of itself. But the way that it gets picked up by the media and becomes a national news story is extremely important. And if that is what the Romney supporters or Romney team did, which was to vote for Cain, to basically make it look like Cain had trumped Perry in a big way, that becomes a national news story and probably is sufficient to take the wind at least out of the sails of the Perry campaign.
Scott?
The one thing I will add in highlighting what the professor said, within the context of the straw poll, it's irrelevant to how the rest of this campaign is going to play out. It is a blip on the radar screen. It is a week and change of news. It is probably 2 weeks of news in Florida, and maybe it's about a month of news to those that are very politically active in Florida. But outside of that, it's fairly irrelevant. The one thing that it does highlight is based on or built on what happened at the actual debate was you see Rick Perry. He's taken a little bit of a ding. He didn't perform particularly well in the debate, and for majority of those out there didn't watch the debate, but now they're hearing about it, and so not only they're hearing that he performed not particularly well, but they're also seeing that he came in second to Herman Cain. So that'll again within the realm of what it is. It's not particularly relevant, but for short time's sake, it is.
Yes.
For Ms. Owen, you said you spoke about super candidates.
One of the candidates out who's going right now, who do you think would be a super candidate?
Wow. I guess the model for a super candidate that kind of in this era that I think is a prototype was probably Bill Clinton, because he could play in both worlds very well. He could, appeal to the traditional media, and he also did well in the new media. I think, in a certain sense, it's hard to say. Are you thinking about the Republican field that's out there in terms of those candidates? It's really hard for me to identify one that does particularly well in both realms. And I think that's when good campaign management comes into play, because typical candidates are probably better in one area than another. And I would imagine that it's probably better, at least if you have a less kind of the ability to appeal to the public on a personal level. That's something that's very important, and I think a lot of the female candidates on the Republican side seem to have that kind of warm, personal way of relating that plays well in social media. I think Mitt Romney does probably not play as well in that kind of in that case. So. Super candidates are hard to find, and that's, like I said, I think where a good campaign organization, good media strategy, and the ability to kind of make a candidate appear better in both places. I don't even think Barack Obama is a super candidate. I don't think he had that kind of Bill Clinton ease of flowing between the two types of media. He's probably better in the more formal media.
In the 2010 midterm election, we saw that many of the GOP candidates were funded by, or partially funded by, 527 organizations such as American Crossroads, partially advised by Karl Rove. What role do you think that these organizations play in getting a candidate elected, and do you think they'll play an increased role in the future?
Yeah, I briefly mentioned that. The term of endearment under the IRS code is C4, is what those organizations are. And as I mentioned, I mean, it is a completely new world where you now not only are running against your opponent, but you're also possibly running against an independent expenditure, which could easily dwarf your opponent's, ability to hit the media or raise money, that sort of thing. It's a new world. Any candidate out there now that may have some opponents, whether it's issue advocacy or others, they very well could have a mediocre opponent, which with the Supreme Court case, Citizens United will, in essence, allow anybody to put in their personal wealth or organizations to bolster that mediocre candidate. So it certainly changes the playing field.
It seems that the media coverage, as well as the public, is moving more towards the candidate themselves versus where the candidates stand on the issues. What do you think the implications of this are for our democracy?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the biggest trends that we've seen is the more personalization of politics. It's not anything that's particularly new, but I think it's become exacerbated in this particular campaign or media environment because first of all, there's fewer investigative journalists who are out there getting issues out and really, trying to look at the substance of the campaign and the substance of, kind of the important policies that need to be discussed. Instead, what's happening is the personal aspects of, a candidate get, kind of top billing, and that becomes more and more important with social media because social media, in a certain sense, is highly personal, and so those kinds of kind of information bits are the ones that disseminate most quickly. And I think, we kind of have a celebrity culture as well, and that kind of information is something that the public has become kind of conditioned to accepting as part of their news. What do I think are the implications for democracy? When it used to be the case that candidate's character, whether you could trust that candidate, whether the candidate was a good leader, those kinds of skill type issues were, or kind of personality issues were at the forefront, I didn't think it was such a bad thing. Not everyone could be informed on every issue, and issues change as oftentimes when candidates are elected to office. But what I think is happening now is that it's very non-relevant parts of a candidate's personality that are getting the play, things that have nothing to do with their skills to govern. So I think it's really damaging, and frankly, I'm frustrated in terms of what can be done to kind of change that dynamic.
The one thing I would add, just from a real-world experience, and within the last year, we've seen this. Normally, the mainstream media, your print reporters, your TV reporters, are not going to delve into personal relationships that the candidate might have had or had previously. An example this year, Indiana Governor Mitch Daniels, Republican, was looking at running for president. He has a pretty good track record from a fiscal conservative standpoint. He was very well liked amongst Republican conservatives around the country. He had a pretty good pedigree, and when he was, in essence, taking the final steps to decide whether he was going to run or not, there was stories that spread around the country and originated from social media about how his wife had had an affair back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. That story, in essence, was out there more than talk about what Daniels did as governor, what he had previously done as when he was at OMB under a previous administration, and other stories that he wanted to get out. That, in essence, pretty much killed his campaign from day one. Taken off. So it's an example of how social media works or can be destructive to candidates.
We thank you very much for coming. Thank the speakers.